Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by the UC San Diego Institute for Practical Ethics. I am Cristina Della Coletta, Dean of the Division of Arts and Humanities, and it is my pleasure to open today's discussion and welcome our guest, Dov Fox. I want to recognize the difficult moment in which we are living as we continue to adapt and respond to the pandemic. Your time, especially today, is precious, and we're grateful you have chosen to be here with us. The Institute for Practical Ethics develops, promotes, and supports research on some of the most pressing ethical issues facing the public today. It has evolved into a living hub of researchers committed to questions about the ethics and social implications of groundbreaking science, technology, and medicine. Having the Institute in the Division of Arts and Humanities speaks directly to our interdisciplinary nature, which we know is both foundational and transformative. I continue to be grateful to directors Craig Callender and John Evans, who are committed to bridging the sciences and the humanities for social good. We say this often when discussing the Institute, so I will end here. Our curiosity must be matched by our empathy, and good science is responsible, socially conscious science. Now, please welcome John Evans, co-director of the Institute for Practical Ethics. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As Christina said, my name is John Evans. I'm a professor of sociology and the co-director of the Institute for Practical Ethics. I would like to welcome Dov Fox as our second keynote lecturer for the 2020-2021 school year. Dov Fox is the Herzog Endowed Scholar, a professor of law and director of the Center for Health, Law and Policy and Bioethics at the University of San Diego School of Law. He received a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, where he finished a doctorate in political theory, then returned to the US and received his law degree from Yale in 2010. He clerked for the Ninth Circuit US Court of Appeals. His expertise is broadly in bioethics and health law, particularly regarding human reproduction. He's authored more than 60 scholarly articles, as well as a recently published book titled Birthrights and Wrongs: How Medicine and Technology Are Remaking Reproduction and Law. Today's talk is titled Donor 9623 and the Strange Business of Making Babies. He will talk for 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions from the audience. If you want to ask a question, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question, and Craig Callender will be leading that conversation towards the end. So without further ado, welcome Dov Fox.
Dean Coletta, John Evans, thank you for that very generous introduction and the opportunity to join the rich community that you and Craig Callender have built here at the Institute for Practical Ethics. You know, I read John's early books as a student, books about what it means to be human and make a family. He helped make those big questions inescapable for me. So it's a special privilege to share in that conversation with you all today. Grad school, it's also when I discovered that I was born just a couple of days before this baby right here, albeit with a whole lot less fanfare.
She's doing just fine. She really is. She's adorable. She's just so precious. And asleep.
You've seen the newspapers today, and you know the telegrams that have come and the offers that have been made to you. Does it worry you that she may carry the label test tube baby?
I really don't. No, it doesn't worry me. I think that this will all die down, and she'll just be our Elizabeth.
This is a baby who grew from the follicle through conception and gestation in a way no other baby in America has ever done before.
Elizabeth Carr's arrival, it set off a moral panic in this country, including charges that parents and doctors were treading on the terrain that belonged to nature and God.
Doing just
Also brought opposition from the Catholic Church, from the Virginia Society for Human Life, whose President Charles Dean claims the clinic will increase the number of abortions, and from Washington, where Utah Senator Orrin Hatch says there are still too many unanswered religious, ethical, moral, and legal questions about in vitro fertilization.
This wasn't just sex without reproduction, but reproduction without sex. And it raised a whole host of new debates beyond just when life begins to how it gets made, and even what kinds of human beings we make. The idea unsettled a lot of people, and it put lawmakers in a bind. The government could ban IVF, but now that the technology worked, how could they deny it to thousands of desperate couples, like the parents of Elizabeth Carr? Another option was to regulate assisted reproduction. But conservatives worried that would legitimize a practice they found deeply troubling, while liberals feared opening the door to restrictions on who got to have a baby. That left a third option: do nothing. Let the private sector sort it out. And that's exactly what happened. At the federal level, we've got nothing more than STD testing for germ donors and voluntary reporting of the pregnancies that clinics create. Countries like the United Kingdom, they have whole national agencies that are designed to license and monitor procreation specialists. Not in the US. The states here, they don't do anything to stop reproductive negligence either. That leaves the industry to make its own rules through professional organizations like the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. But they lack the authority to enforce any guidelines they issue, or even the auditing power to detect violations. Which explains where we are today, over 1 million American IVF babies later. Here's a clip from the podcast.
1 in every 50 kids born in the United States today is conceived in a fertility clinic or petri dish. The stakes are so high, yet oversight is shockingly low. Let me put it this way: nail salons, potato chips, pretty much every other service or product you can think of is better regulated.
This case, Donor 9623, the one I made a podcast about after the book, I'll have more to say about that shortly. But for now, this in vitro fertilization that was born when I was in the United States, that was just the start of the reproductive revolution. My lifetime has witnessed advances like expansive genetic testing on embryos before deciding which of them to implant, long-lasting reversible birth control implants, and fetal screening just a few weeks into pregnancy using nothing more than a simple blood test. This really is the medicine of miracles. It frees families from terrible diseases, fills their empty cradles, and it lets people plan their lives around when they're ready to have kids. But when you leave a multi-billion-dollar industry to police itself, things can go wrong. These aren't just avoidable mishaps, but ones that shouldn't happen. What we call in other areas of medicine, never events. When a pharmacist fills your prescription for birth control pills with prenatal vitamins, or a lab loses a cancer survivor's eggs, or a fertility clinic exposes a couple's embryos to mad cow disease, or an obstetrician tells a woman that the pregnancy she longed for is too risky for her to keep, when in fact it would have been perfectly healthy. Some of these mix-ups rob people of the ability to reproduce at all. Infertile and same-sex couples who want a genetic child, they trust clinics with their dreams of reproductive parenthood.
The incident at Pacific Fertility Center in San Francisco happened on the same day as University Hospitals in Cleveland. The level of liquid nitrogen in a cryo-storage tank used to preserve eggs and embryos dropped, raising the temperature in the tank and putting the eggs and embryos at risk.
There have been 3 fertility freezer failures just like this in the United States since 2005. Other reproductive mishaps affect people who are trying not to have kids. In 2015, more than 100 women found themselves pregnant when their birth control pills were packaged wrong.
For generations, women have relied on the pill to avoid pregnancy. But a new lawsuit says 8 brands of birth control pills failed, putting 113 women in danger of unintended pregnancies because the pills were defectively and dangerously designed, manufactured, packaged, sold, and distributed. The defendants, Endo Pharmaceuticals of Ireland and its subsidiary Qualitest, based in Pennsylvania. The suit alleges the pills were packaged upside down, reversing the order. So the placebo pills were taken at the start of the women's 28-day cycle rather than the end. And that left the women without adequate contraception and at risk for unwanted pregnancy.
That was the 4th mass recall in the last decade alone. Then there are mix-ups where people who wanted a certain type of child, say one who is healthy or genetically related to them, get one who differs from what reproductive professionals had led them to believe. The case at the center of that podcast involves a sperm donor, number 9623. Here's a mock-up of his catalog profile. It says he's a Tom Cruise lookalike, but a foot taller. The neuroscience engineering PhD student was an internationally acclaimed drummer who played 6 sports and spoke 5 languages. He boasted a love of nature and family and an IQ of 160, same as Einstein. Scores of families from around the world paid thousands of dollars for samples from this man, who the sperm bank called the perfect donor. Until an email glitch leaked his actual identity, and publicly available information about him revealed a host of discrepancies. The truth was, he dropped out of college and been convicted of felony burglary after a series of arrests and a history of struggle with serious mental illness, including bipolar disorder with grandiose delusions and schizophrenia. In all of these cases, the fertility freezer failures, the birth control blunders, the donor misrepresentations, victims try to take badly behaving professionals to court, but their cases almost always get dismissed. Suits for breach of contract fail because providers are savvy enough not to promise any concrete results of the care they provide, and they have patients sign liability waivers anyway. Property claims for lost embryos or eggs get tossed because judges are understandably reluctant to conceptualize the stuff of life as mere possessions. And medical malpractice suits go bust when the undue risks that providers take are standard operating procedure in the field. The defense is basically, everyone else is doing it too. The Tennessee Supreme Court summed up the state of affairs in a 2015 case, explaining, quote, "The law does not recognize the disruption of family planning as an independent cause of action or an element of damages." This puzzling gap in the law, that's what led me to study hundreds of cases like this and talk with people on all sides of them. That inquiry turned up 3 kinds of controversies. Some, like the freezer malfunctions, leaves couples without the baby they longed for. We call these no baby cases. Others, like the faulty birth control, foist on individuals the very pregnancy or birth they've been trying to avoid. Any baby cases. In others cases still, like 9623, parents end up with a particular kind of baby, one whose genetic traits are meaningfully different than the ones they'd selected. Lawmakers have declined to regulate in ways that might deter all three forms of reproductive harm, while insurers are wary of exposure to the prohibitive costs that typify these kinds of injuries. That leaves judges in the uncomfortable position of being asked to vindicate those reproductive interests after a professional violates them. There's nothing in the Constitution or any statute that protects against negligently frustrated efforts to have no baby or any baby, let alone a baby of a particular type. And it's been over a century since judges flexed their common law muscles to create new rights to recover for wrongdoing that the legal system has left unresponded to. Rights like privacy, libel, informed consent. So today's plaintiffs, they missed that heyday of private law expansion. But the explosion of reproductive negligence and the obstacles to courtroom relief I'll describe more in a moment leads me to think that now is the time for judges to recover that muscle memory and establish three new rights of reproduction. I call these procreation deprived, procreation imposed, and procreation confounded. Start with those no baby cases, like a clinic accidentally implants your only embryos into someone else, or a pharmacist swaps your prenatal vitamins with abortion pills, or a doctor tells you your wanted pregnancy would risk your life when it wouldn't have. When plaintiffs who are deprived of procreation in these ways take negligent professionals to court, they lose just about every time. For one, plaintiffs who are deprived of procreation in this case, the providers, they never promised that they'd get a baby to take home. And the losses, however devastating, they aren't a physical or economic kind that courts usually require as a threshold requirement to seal off the proverbial floodgate of litigation they might fear if they allowed suits for purely intangible or emotional harms. Judges also say these victims can still adopt. And it's not like the wrongdoing left them any more childless than they were before, given the infertility they already had. Nature's to blame, courts say, just as much as negligence is. But for those who wanted to reproduce, being denied whatever opportunity they had, that causes them real suffering. This is the memorial that victims who lost their eggs and embryos in one of those recent fertility tank crashes had inscribed on a cemetery bench outside of Cleveland. It reads, "We toiled to get you. We celebrated to have you. We wept when we lost you. We'll never forget you. Dedicated to the memory of our hopes and dreams lost." Courts face a different kind of challenge when procreation is imposed, when doctors fail to diagnose an unintended pregnancy until it's too late to safely or legally end it, or when they botch a vasectomy, or leave a woman's tubes untied, or when contraceptive rings or patches don't work how they're supposed to. In these cases, judges are strangely suspicious that plaintiffs are trying to make someone else, a doctor or pharmacist, pay for their own reproductive recklessness, insisting they can't really have wanted to avoid having a baby if they could have opted for abortion or adoption and didn't. But that doesn't seem right. Just because you didn't want a baby in the first place doesn't mean that once you were made pregnant against your will, you can't have wanted those other alternatives even less. Underlying these concerns is a deeper one. Even if you didn't plan on having a child, once you hold him in your arms and see him smile, how could you not appreciate him as a blessing? One who makes your life better, not worse. This objection sounds in the register of parental love, what it means to welcome a newborn unconditionally. But standing up for your reproductive interests doesn't mean you love your child any less. And loving the child you got doesn't mean you weren't injured when pregnancy or parenthood was negligently imposed on you. finally, are cases in which procreation is confounded. This third group involves people who wanted a baby and got one, except a donor switch or embryo misdiagnosis foiled the genetic tie or good health they hoped their baby would have. Courts deny a remedy in these cases too. They say it'd send an intolerable message that parents wish their own child had never been born, or that some people are too defective in their very DNA to justify their existence. Judges conclude that thwarted selection isn't a legitimate harm. Quote, "We're unwilling to say that life, even life with severe impairments, may ever amount to a legal injury." And they bar these claims as no less than eugenic. Quote, "If we accept that the birth of one child should have been prevented, it's a short step to accepting that the births of whole classes of children should be similarly prevented." Courts that are willing even to entertain these grievances insist that damages are too speculative to award anyway, that it's impossible to measure these reproductive losses in monetary terms. And even if they could, trying to put a price tag on the life of a child, it's unseemly. They're right to the extent that these harms don't translate into dollars and cents with any kind of precision. But that doesn't make those harms any less real or serious or any harder to define than other intangible harms that courts remedy all the time. Take the loss of dignity in a case about wrongful conviction, or the loss of companionship in a case about wrongful death. Courts can determine awards in two steps. The first asks, to what extent is misconduct to blame? A lab that destroys a fertility patient's embryos shouldn't be held responsible for the loss of a baby that patients might not have gotten anyway. The loss is instead the chance of biological parenthood that the lab's negligence took from the couple. Now, that's a complex question about probabilities, to be sure, but nothing that courts don't answer all the time. For example, when a doctor's failure to catch a patient's signs of cancer makes that disease less treatable, even if it might have killed him anyway. The second question has to do with the severity of that reproductive injury in terms of its characteristic consequences for the people who suffer it. These parents, they're not suing for having gotten a bad kid, let alone a wrongful birth, as some courts say. They're making heart-rending decisions in a society that's often inhospitable to disability and difference about whether their family has the wherewithal to care for a child with special needs. Before judges throw up their hands and declare these losses too awkward to value, why not just ask people what these adversities are like for them, whether they cause the offense that is assumed? Empirical tools like life satisfaction surveys can give a reasonably reliable sense of when reproductive negligence tends to cause more suffering or less. For example, when it denies people their last real chance for any kid, as opposed to a shot at the girl they wanted to balance out the 4 boys they already have. Or when it foists an unplanned baby on a teenage mom, rather than a married couple with already established careers. These harms may also be offset by countervailing benefits. American judges can look abroad for guidance to Singapore's highest court. They found a fertility clinic liable for switching a husband's sperm with a stranger's. The unanimous court, in a show of penetrating wisdom, cited my work to establish a first-of-its-kind right to genetic affinity. The judges, they awarded the couple about $80,000, a total that was appropriately offset by the joy that the mix-up simultaneously brought them. The court called this case the hardest in its history, in part because the couple discovered the mix-up only because the child was born with conspicuously darker skin than either of theirs. There have been similar cases in the US, and there's no easy way to resolve those controversies. They implicate matters as profound and intimate and divisive as child welfare and parental love and racial inclusion.
Jennifer Cramblett gave birth to her daughter Peyton 2 years ago.
We love her more to this day. She's made us the people that we are. Never trade it for the world.
Despite that love, Cramblett is suing the Midwest Sperm Bank in Downers Grove, Illinois, for medical malpractice. Cramblett says she thought she was being inseminated with a white man's sperm so the baby would look like her partner, Amanda Zinkin.
Hence why we chose a blonde hair, blue eye individual.
According to the lawsuit, after Cramblett was pregnant, she found out she was mistakenly inseminated with an African American man's sperm instead.
In the question and answer, I'd be happy to discuss what strikes me as the best way to deter reproductive negligence and compensate its victims, while preserving access to valuable services for patients and responding to real risks of psychological harm to children and the erosion of our commitment to equality. For now, though, I want to say a bit more about the one case that after writing the book, I couldn't stop thinking about. Here's a refresher from the podcast.
This guy on paper spoke 5 languages, working on a PhD in science engineering, IQ of 160.
What you thought you were getting, you were not getting. He allegedly fathered at least 36 children.
Who was this guy? And what drove him to do what he did?
I don't know if he had a messiah complex.
I turned just to look at him, and when I did that, it triggered something, and he kind of stormed at me.
This story, it's not just about this one guy or this one case. It's about a whole industry that creates millions of babies all around the world.
They're going to win the game of life by spreading their seed.
Who do they think they are by hiding all this stuff?
What was your donor number?
I think it was 9623.
Sperm banks, they keep donor identities secret, so parents can't vet them on their own. College-age men are promised an easy, anonymous way to trade ramen for steak. Sperm banks aren't required to run background checks or test for even severe disorders that their kids might inherit. If those sperm banks do learn of any actionable medical issues, they don't have to share those updates with the families who use their sperm, or might. They don't report or even track the number of births that a man fathers either. Ancestry sites like 23andMe reveal that popular donors can have scores of kids, even hundreds.
How do I know I'm getting quality?
Don't worry. Our donors have to pass a rigorous screening process.
All done!
Thank you.
Always a pleasure. What a beautiful little girl!
Because so much about a donor is self-reported, taken on faith, his health history, criminal, educational records, any discrepancies stay hidden unless his identity gets leaked and the truth is something that you can Google. That's the only reason the story of 9623 wound up in court wherever the sperm bank shipped his samples, to families in 6 states and 3 countries and 2 continents. I came in thinking this case was all about the imponderables of a life lived in the grip of serious risk. The court documents about this man revealed his struggles with ominous hallucinations and suicide attempts, tied to a diagnosis that is partly genetic. Would his biological kids, would they be okay?
The rage started early, collapsing on the floor in kindergarten, not responding to anyone, screaming fits in first grade with signs of bipolar disorder, disappearing into the woods in third grade.
And then we found on his phone that he was searching how to kill myself and how to kill my perfect stepbrother.
But it wouldn't be until March of 2017 that Wendy Norman would discover her 15-year-old's behavioral and mental issues likely tied back to his birth and sperm donor number 9623.
For me, I'm scared. How do I help my son?
For families I talk to, like Wendy Norman and her son, Alex, if they did get sick, it's impossible to prove that the donor's genes were to blame. Scientists have linked schizophrenia to hundreds of genetic mutations working together in complicated ways. And lots of other factors contribute too: pregnancy complications, childhood stress, drug use. But for all we don't know about how mental illness is caused, one thing is clear: having a parent with the condition makes it way more likely that you'll develop it too. From about 1% to 10 to 20%. But this case was really about more than hard to predict risks. The deeper questions went back to the birth of the fertility industry. Should families be able to count on the kind of health and safety that we insist in the cars we drive and the food we eat? Or is making babies different, just a crapshoot, however you do it? The parents who chose 9623 feel betrayed by the professionals they trusted to help them make a family. And now they live in fear with anxiety about a potentially scary future. But how can they complain about the very misrepresentations that led them to pick this donor, who gave them their child? In the podcast interviews, I tried to make sense of these really hard, almost existential questions.
What's it reasonable for parents who go to a sperm bank to expect?
Honesty. That's what I was expecting. Honesty. Let it be my choice. I'm the one who's going to be raising that child. You don't expect perfection, but oh my God, I mean, you expect honesty. Like you're dealing with creating a person, a life. Like, where's the decency? And
what does it say about the plaintiffs that say, I'm a good-looking guy with high IQ, like that's the baby I want. I don't want dumb baby. I want smart, good-looking baby. There seems to me to be something distasteful of, I'm going to go on this website and find the best-looking dude who purports to have the highest IQ and the best credentials because that's what I want. This guy only went to West Georgia, not UGA. This guy only got a master's degree, not a PhD. I want a child, and I want it to be that awesome child.
I just get frustrated that nobody seems to make Zytex accountable. I've made a choice and love her to death. And hindsight, yeah, I mean, I would pick a different donor.
And then you would have ended up with a different kid. I wonder how you sort of help her make sense of that.
She said, well, you mean you wouldn't have me? And I said, I know. I said, had I not gone donor, you wouldn't be here. It might be a different version of you, right? And she goes, yeah, but you would so miss me. And I said, absolutely. Yeah, but how would you ever live without me? And I said, I know, I can't even imagine. Yeah, it's hard for her to understand. It's hard for me to understand.
That last mom, Linda, is struggling to make sense of this inescapable fact. If not for the sperm bank's failure to screen its donors better, the child she got, her daughter, who she has and loves, she wouldn't exist. And that fact, that's why every court that's heard these cases before the podcast came out dismissed it. One even called what the sperm bank had allegedly done in failing to screen the donor in even basic ways reckless, reprehensible, and repugnant. But the court said that letting the parents sue would send a message they just wouldn't, that parents wish their own child hadn't been born. But if the capacity for parental love knows no bounds, where does that leave us? Does this business of making human beings just get a free pass? That's the question I posed. And then, after the podcast came out, the highest court in Georgia heard the case anew. And they asked that question too.
Just to be clear what you're asserting, a sperm bank can completely misrepresent everything about the sperm it's selling and charge whatever amount of money based on those representations and completely lie to every customer it has, and nobody can do a thing about it.
8 months later, the court released its opinion on the case, ruling families can sue sperm banks for consumer fraud if they lie about their donors.
So the justices, they still refuse to recognize any legal claim that depends on the idea, the one they said is too offensive, that a child could be considered an injury. But they said that proposition couldn't just leave reproductive professionals immune, let them even lie to the people they serve. They said the parents could still argue that they'd been deprived of actionable medical information that might have spared their kids pain and suffering if they'd known it early on, been able to intervene at a young age. The court also said that misrepresenting donor information might constitute deceptive trade practices like consumer fraud. Now, that might not sound so surprising. I mean, this is just sperm, right? It's advertised like crazy and sold for a pretty penny. But admitting that donor selection is like shopping, treating parents like consumers, it gets at a word that looms over this whole story: eugenics. The American sperm banking industry, it started in the early 1980s with the explicit mission of mass breeding genius kids to combat the hordes of stupid people degrading the human gene pool. That's what the founder said, this founder of the Repository for Germinal Choice, also known as the Nobel Sperm Bank, which collected samples from only the most vigorous and brilliant men.
A donor to the repository has to be, first of all, almost perfectly healthy. Health is the most valuable heritable trait. Runner-up in importance is intelligence. So our donors ought to be very bright. As a matter of fact, all but one or two have an IQ of better than 130.
Modern sperm banks, they try to distance themselves from this eugenic vision. They aren't trying to engineer perfect babies from superior sperm. They're just trying to give customers whatever they want. One sperm bank CEO told me, if people were looking for high school dropouts, that's what we'd give them. But is this vision, is that really so different? If you take away the bigotry and the blueprint for what type of people to create, not government, let alone the sperm bank telling us what to do, is there anything wrong with letting individuals choose, individual people and couples, based on their own preferences, their own sense of control, or whatever sense of control you can sell them on. Here's a few more clips from the podcast.
I could have went to a bar and just done what some people do, right? But no, I wanted to be responsible. If you're in a relationship, I mean, if you don't ask those questions, shame on you. If you're purchasing something and it was documented that you're getting this, and it turns out half of it is wrong, and it's not only just, oh, his eyes aren't blue. It's like, my gosh, it's genetic conditions that I may have passed on to my child. And that's shame on them.
What's okay to want in a child when you're in a position to try and choose? Just health? IQ and education? What about height or perfect pitch? At what point does it cross the line from just wanting the best for your future kid to designing a baby to suit your tastes? When you conceive a baby with a partner, it may not even occur to you that there are any discrete qualities you'd want to see in a child you might have together. But selecting someone to have a baby with takes on a very different feel when you're handed a catalog containing hundreds of detailed profiles. Donor 9623's is 26 pages of physical features, personality tests, and meticulous descriptions of every blood relative. How could this exhaustive inventory not inflate your sense of control over the genetic lottery? Give the illusion of greater influence than you really have over what your future kid will be like?
Suing over thwarted expectations for a donor who's like this, not that. It seems to be in tension with a parental love that isn't conditioned on any genetic particulars. But maybe that love that parents have for their children, maybe it's rich enough to seek certain characteristic in a child before he's born, with the knowledge that after he comes to be, you'll love him no matter what, just because he's ours, whether or not he has any features that the parents wished for. Those features might come and go, and the love you have for your child will be the same. This kind of resilience, maybe it's more compatible with a choosiness for certain kinds of traits rather than others. It may be one that's limited to medical characteristics. This is an intuition that was captured in a scene from the 1997 film, Gattaca.
Your extracted eggs, Marie, have been fertilized with Antonio's sperm. You have...
Whether prospective parents are selecting among donors or embryos, this technology, it isn't cheap. Trying to buy sperm from a particular sperm donor can cost up to $10,000 if you get a few vials, wanting not just one child, but another from the same donor, and another extra or two in case it doesn't work the first time. Embryo screening, well, that can cost $100,000 for IVF, and the extra that prenatal genetic diagnosis costs on embryos before you implant them. These serious expenses, they're not covered by insurance or the government. If only the wealthy can afford screening for genetic conditions like cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs disease, sickle cell anemia, those conditions might end up becoming proxies for class. Only certain kinds of people are born with them, let alone more common ones that we might one day be able to screen for, including disposition to certain cancers, height, obesity. Now, society could narrow this gap between the haves and have-nots through universal insurance coverage for prenatal screening, at least for certain conditions. But even if everyone was given an equal chance to choose their child's genetic start in life, that gives rise to a distinct concern. that any adversities a kid is born with are no longer something that could have happened to any of us, something that inspires sympathy and support, because there but for the grace of God go I, or my kid, but instead becomes a problem that you brought on yourself and should be left to deal with on your own. I'm just speculating here. Maybe our society is more compassionate than I'm giving us credit for. I hope so. Still, there's one more concern, one more thing that makes me uneasy, even if we address these concerns about equality of access and empathy for others. Denmark has among the world's most generous accommodations for people with disabilities in school and at work. But since that country became the first one to offer universal prenatal screening for Down syndrome to every pregnant woman, the number of kids born with that condition has dropped so dramatically that people with Down syndrome in Denmark have virtually disappeared. I went into the story of 9623 assuming that it was about a donor who went rogue and an industry that was unaccountable and the families that were coming to grips with what all that deception meant for them. But I came away thinking this business of deciding who exists and who doesn't was a lot more, well, complicated.
I was really proud of like all the things that he put down for like his accomplishments. I was just very happy that I got lucky with the donor that I had.
When Alex saw that TV clip of his biological father, it was deeply unsettling. Alex said he looked like a homeless woodsman, nothing like the perfect donor. As a kid, you're left to wonder, which one is me?
There's a lot that we don't really think about if we haven't been adopted or we're not conceived by donor sperm, that tie of who you really are. It's the DNA for this little individual that we've created who I couldn't love more than another human being on the face of the earth. I wanted to build a story beyond what was written on the paper, right? Who's my donor? What's he like? What's he into? Is he a good person?
Donor 9623, the real Chris, wasn't the Superman his profile described. But he wasn't an egomaniac with a messiah complex either. The man I'd finally interviewed seemed to be a well-functioning adult. He was mostly warm, occasionally guarded, other times, surprisingly vulnerable. He was, in a word, complicated.
For the first time after the podcast, the courts let the parents and the kids or suits go to trial. The donor and the sperm bank, I think they had a lot to be sorry for. You know, it's not exactly the Wild West, but this unregulated domain of procreation gone awry, it left kids like Alex, parents like Angie, with real needs that these families can't afford. But enforcing reproductive expectations, I worry it could come at a real cost. In the end, I'm left wondering, in a world of routine selection and robust entitlements, would we close ourselves off to the diversity of human lives, even more than we do today? Or fail to appreciate the vulnerabilities that we all share? Or lose a sense of collective responsibility for those among us in need? Or miss the humility that parenthood teaches, however our kids come to be? I'm so grateful for the chance to think through these hard questions together with all of you. And I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Dov. That was wonderful. I'm Craig Callender, professor of philosophy and the other co-director of the Institute for Practical Ethics. If you have a question, just click on the Q&A button down at the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen, and I'll read it out to Dov, and he can then answer. Okay. Well, we've got a couple of questions already. Are you ready, Dov?
Let's do it.
All right. How do you weigh an individual's autonomy against those on a broader scheme level who argue that the control of reproductive rights furthers social eugenics? So we begin with the big one.
Yeah, that's a really hard question. So I think that we are looking not just at individual autonomy interests, but more so the consequences that these cases have for the people whose lives they upend. But you're right that it poses real challenges for what kinds of people we create, especially in cases where people wanted children of a particular sex or race, health, as opposed to disabling conditions. The way we balance that, I think, is to consider those broad interests that individuals have and stripped from some of those more troublesome or offensive particulars. So we could offer a measure of recovery in these lawsuits for something like a thwarted interest in offspring selection writ large, but no extra or special awards for particular characteristics that we worry might further a social eugenics agenda or other kinds of offensive ideas. That would award, say, a baseline amount that wasn't keyed or targeted to the specifics of particularly problematic characteristics. It's not going to answer these problems, to be sure. It's trying to strike this balance in a way that we're not really going to be able to eliminate or do away with, but only negotiate as a trade-off among these values, individual efforts to control the fate of their reproductive lives, and troubling ideas about what sorts of people should exist.
Actually, I'd like to just come in and ask a kind of follow-up question, because I had a question about Denmark. So now there are very few people with Down syndrome being born there. I mean, do we know anything yet about the reaction this has had in society? So are parents who chose to have Down syndrome children, are they being ostracized, or is there any kind of, has there been a measured back reaction?
You know, it's a really, I haven't seen really good data on this, but what evidence there is from the laws and policies in the country make it really confusing. On the one hand, if you have a child born with Down syndrome in Denmark, if you get that diagnosis and then choose to have that child, the child has all kinds of protections and accommodations from a very early age in school and medicine and opportunities throughout life that they don't in the rest of the world. And if you ask people how they regard people with Down syndrome, they will point to a popular television show there that portrays them in a really favorable light. And yet at the same time, the numbers have dropped so precipitously that last year there were only 18 people with Down syndrome born in the entire country, compared with over 6,000 in the United States, just to give a frame of reference. So on the one hand, you've got legal protections and what seems like very favorable social judgments. And yet, when would-be parents are making these decisions when they're voting with their feet, so to speak. They decide to end pregnancies for Down syndrome. Hard to know what to make of that.
Yeah, maybe it's too early to tell, but it is interesting natural experiment because of switching from bad luck to your choice, in the way you put it on the slide. Okay, let me go with the second question. Regarding your comment on whether there's anything wrong with letting people choose, what do you say to those who argue that recognizing legal claims by parents for children born with traits that the parents did not want, such as certain skin color or genetic disorder, can be seen as derogatory to people who live with that trait? That sends a message to those people that what they are is so bad that it can be the basis of legal action. And more broadly, that this might reinforce societal prejudice against those people.
I say that's a very real risk, live possibility, one that needs to be carefully considered and balanced against however it is that we think it makes sense to enforce people's reproductive rights in this area. It's easy to see how people would be deeply offended by the idea that the very condition they have was a basis not only for others to decide that they didn't want a child of that kind, but also that a court said that having a child like you with the thing that you have is a legal injury or a basis for recovery, compensation, a harm that was done to you as the parents. It's really hard to avoid the idea that that's a really offensive message that is sent, whatever the fact of what the individual parents intended. They may have not meant to send that message, mean nothing like it at all. They were instead just trying to make a decision for themselves about their own family in the context of their own circumstances, with reasons that might have nothing to do with those more deeply offensive ones. And yet it's hard to avoid that message being sent. Certainly context matters. Race is particularly problematic in this country. I mean, not until 1967 did the Supreme Court strike down interracial marriage bans. Before that, in 38 states, we had policies of racial purity that banned marriage between whites and blacks, and adoption agencies classified children into gradations of racial admixture so as to avoid getting someone of the wrong race. I mean, we've got a very deep and relatively recent history of racial ordering that makes the idea of compensating for getting a child of a particular type deeply problematic. The question is whether avoiding those harms should lead us to immunize an entire industry when it's the case that some people make those choices, and when those choices are negligently or wrongfully thwarted or frustrated. As I suggested, I don't think that a blanket immunity for this industry is the right way to go, but any kind of response that affords some kind of recovery or compensation has to be really, really careful about how it's worded, about how that recovery is framed, what compensation is for, very clear to avoid the obviously incendiary messages and the deeply problematic, offensive meanings that it can convey to people with that condition. The last thing I want to say, but I see there's a long queue, forgive me. I also worried a lot about the individual children who are created, whose parents sue because they got them. What about the psychological harm to those individual children themselves, the subject of the lawsuit, the ones who are called a wrongful birth? I talked with a lot of the children who were the object of these suits in the case of donor 9623, and I asked them that hard question. Ones like Alex Norman, who you heard from in a couple of those clips. And the answer they gave was really interesting. It was a lot less about the philosophical questions of existence and reckoning with the fact that a different donor would have meant they wouldn't have existed, and a lot more with like the sociological facts about how they relate to their parents today. They say they're old enough to know that their parents love them deeply, profoundly. because of how they've grown up with their parents and their parents have treated them up until this time, and that they're suing just to get more resources for them to help with their medical expenses or to screen risks or otherwise. And at least the ones I talked with, they were a little older. They didn't seem offended or hurt at all. If anything, they appreciated that these suits on their behalves were a reflection of the love their parents had for them in a way that would provide for them more resources in order to aid their development, which I thought was really interesting, rather than imputing the idea of offense to them necessarily in a way that seems very natural, just asking them, well, how do you feel? How does this lawsuit, this idea, how do you react to it? I got a very different response than I had expected.
Thanks. Okay, our next question is, do you think that robust regulation of the fertility industry would, for the most part, eliminate the need for wrongful birth suits? Or are there cases that regulations can't address?
That's a great question. I think regulation could go a very long way. If we were to regulate this field more robustly, to require screening of donors, maybe limit the number of embryos that you implant at a time, some kind of donor registry to track the number of births across the country, then you could avoid a lot of these problems that we've been wrestling with back and forth so far in the Q&A, because you wouldn't have to judge after the fact how much a child's life is worth, let alone having gotten a child of one kind rather than another, or the thwarting of reproductive expectations for this rather than that. Instead, you're just regulating in advance before an injury happens. Well, that's good, because then the misconduct doesn't take place, the harm doesn't happen, but also because it in a very real sense avoids those really harmful expressions, those bad messages from having to be sent. And I think regulation really could go a long way. It might indeed obviate the need for a whole host of these suits, right? You could say that at least a defense that clinics or sperm banks, doctors could offer would be that, well, we abided by the reasonable regulations for the standard of care that we were supposed to provide. It's reasonable, and we abided by that, so there should be no lawsuit. Either you followed the regulations or not, in which case you pay some fine or fee accordingly. Maybe you get your license taken away. Are there cases where regulation couldn't respond? Sure, regulation can't catch everything, but it might go far enough that we wouldn't need to wade into this really controversial territory over contested meanings that wade into the domain of eugenics in order to recover for these deeply felt harms. It's all to say, I think regulation would be really helpful and would indeed address a great number of these challenges that we're seeing today.
Okay, next question is, how did the court address the issue of remedy damages in the recent Zytex case?
So it didn't yet. What the Georgia Supreme Court decided in the case that we heard the oral arguments from over Zoom was in response to a motion to dismiss. So without getting too far into the weeds of the legal procedure, they assumed that what the plaintiffs, the families, were saying about what the sperm bank had done was true, and asking whether the lawsuit could go forward in the first place. And every other court, over a dozen that have heard this case up till now, had decided that the cases had to be dismissed, because even if you assume all that was true, the message was just too offensive, or that there was no way of saying that you were harmed by the child who you are now saying you love, that those benefits outweighed the harms, or you weren't really harmed, all things considered. Now, for the first time, the only thing that the Georgia Supreme Court decided is that the cases can move forward. And what that means is they will now go down to the lower court. So for the first time, they will go to a trial, which will involve a process called discovery, where both sides uncover evidence. They interview witnesses and they look at documents, papers, and filings to discover the truth in order to make legal arguments that now a court will hear for the first time. They'll consider what causes of action are legitimate, what harms can go forward, and if those harms were violated, then what the damages should be to recover for those injuries. So we're a long way off yet from dealing with that question, but for the first time ever, a court will interrogate them, and depending on how they answer those questions about the injuries, will reach an answer and provide some guidance on what the damages could be.
Okay. Does it change the dynamics if the child is never told of where they came from? The parents maximize the desire to have a child with certain traits, and the child is never informed. Is this ruse acceptable?
That's a hard question. I don't think so. I assume that the question is asked from the perspective of something like parental ethics, something like a virtue ethics approach to parenting. What does it mean to be a good parent or to love your child in the right kind of way? And whether that can involve secrets, mistruths, or half-truths about where a child came from, or some obscurity about their past. I think what we've seen in the recent case of children who've grown up after being adopted or born by donor insemination, where that was kept from them from a young age until they found out later. Now with the explosion of consumer DNA testing like 23andMe, grown kids are learning all these things for the first time. So we actually have a pretty large sample of adults who as children were kept secrets from about their origins. And almost uniformly, they say they wish that these secrets had not been kept from them, that even though they were hard truths, even though they posed some risk about how their lives might have unfolded, they wish they had known where they came from or who they were, or this part of their identity that was freighted in some way, but not a reflection of the truth about who they were. And this idea is also reflected in, I mean, stories from the Bible to Star Wars. You know, Luke, I am your father, right? Would it be better for him not to have known that this dark part of his past was, at least genetically speaking, part of who he was? These grown kids today are telling us no, they want to know, but those are hard conversations to have. And when they happen, at what age, and how they happen when they're appropriate, it has to vary from family to family. I think it's a mistake to keep these secrets from kids under almost any circumstances. But let's just take the 9623 families and the specific risk that their kids might be of very serious mental illness. There is a risk of ominous hallucinations, hearing voices, a psychotic break that is indeed really serious and has to be known to be aware that something is amiss. Otherwise, you might think you just have an active imagination, or you're just kind of withdrawing from friends in a way that's hard, but kind of normal. Only if you know to be aware of those risks can you know, for example, not to do marijuana because psychedelic drugs can trigger a psychotic episode. Or if you do start hearing voices, to get help right away, because early intervention can make a really big difference in how your prognosis turns out. That said, that's really heavy stuff for a kid who's super young. And that message has to be delivered, I think, in a way that makes sense. And those are individual choices for parents and families about how they do that. Not easy, to be sure. I don't envy these parents or any who have these really hard things to share with their kids. It's not easy, as are any of these questions, but I do think that keeping those secrets is unjustified.
Okay, thanks. Next question is, do you think there's a tension between legally recognizing the importance of genetic ties by allowing parents to seek damages when they are denied the possibility of having genetically related children, while at the same time permitting an anonymous gamete donation? After all, those children created will be denied a connection with their biological parents.
Yeah, I think there probably is. You know, right behind health, 10 fingers, 10 toes, that genetic tie or affinity is probably the characteristic that's most commonly sought, the thing that people most frequently want to see in their children, and one that we accept almost without reservation as legitimate or good. But the truth is that the social meaning of that genetic connection varies from person to person in really serious, profound ways. I mean, even between me and my wife, probably the biggest disagreement we ever had was about how we would try to have kids. Yeah, I had a lot of question marks about half of my family tree and was interested in trying to adopt. Her mom, my wife, was the last Holocaust survivor of her family. And to her, that genetic connection, was almost a repository of memories that would be lost if not continued through the bloodline. I do think that there is a tension between awarding recovery for that lost shared heredity, and what that genetics means to different people. And it might be offensive to people who are adopted or who don't know their anonymous donor, who don't share that with their parents. Again, this is one of those hard cases in which judges, because they can provide written opinions and tailor awards in careful ways, where I think we can recognize the losses of a shared experience or understanding or identity that means a lot to many people, in a way that tries to minimize the offense to others for whom that lack of connection might be deeply hurtful or insulting because they don't share it or have it. I do think there's an inherent tension, and it's really hard to resolve. As I said, I just think we shouldn't throw up our hands to say these questions are too hard to ask, too difficult for courts to tackle, or immunize an entire industry and leave them at the whims of negligent professionals, and instead try to do what we can to recognize these reproductive interests people have, while trying as best we can at the same time simultaneously to offset those offensive meanings. It's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to completely do away with those offensive meanings. But I think, and it will certainly vary from context to context, trait to trait, case and reason and circumstance at a time, but it's work that I think that we can do, and we have to do, given where we are, at least in this time and place.
Okay, next question is there evidence where the donor 9623 manipulated his profile, or the sperm bank did? You're humanizing the donor in your podcast makes it seem like a donor was created to satisfy the clients.
Really good question. And I didn't get a full answer, but it looked to me like it was a little bit of both. One piece of evidence that I uncovered in the podcast was this audio recording an interview that the sperm bank did with the donor to try to sell him to prospective customers. And it's really interesting hearing the sperm bank donor recruiter build up the donor. It really make him feel super good about his sperm, that he is this, star, this prize, that he's, kind of superior, and encourage him to, it feels like really to build up and inflate his successes. That said, the sperm donor undoubtedly lied. He was asked not just about, any health risks, but over 100 very specific diseases or disorders. And he checked off no for every one of those, including schizophrenia, even though he did have a diagnosis for it. I think what we have in this case, and again, it's not unique to it, he was screened and vetted and recruited in just the way that all donors are for all sperm banks. This is a major one, Zytex, one of the biggest, was a combination of what looks like, kind of an incentive problem. On the one hand, the sperm bank is trying to make more money by having donors who sell more of a sample, and you can even charge more if this particular donor is highly desirable. You can supply as many samples, over a very long period of time. So why wouldn't you try to sell as many as you could, make as much money? I mean, just from a purely capitalistic standpoint of supply and demand. The donor, on the other hand, is a young guy, maybe down on his luck, in need of cash, and he sees a way to make money. In this case, he had a felony burglary on his record that would make it really hard to get other kinds of employment, the kind that would run a background check. So you have a way to make fast cash, and they're not checking in these ways. All the incentives seem to be aligned, where it's everybody can kind of point to everyone else. Yeah, I lied a little bit, says the donor. I omitted some stuff. But on the other hand, the sperm bank kind of built me up. I knew they weren't checking, and that I'd be kept anonymous. And all these incentives seemed wrapped up in a way that are designed to happen again. And because we don't have any records, because donors are kept anonymous, one of the things the sperm bank CEO at the time told me is, we have no idea just how common this kind of case is. And the only reason it came out, as I mentioned, is because his identity was accidentally leaked, and all these public documents were available for just his name and email available online. So it could happen a lot more than we realize, this incentive problem.
Thank you. Okay, this question comes in to me actually via email because of a problem with the Q&A function, and I will abbreviate it a little bit. I'm not sure what the obstacle to civil liability is. First, there can be wrongdoing without harm. A can wrong B by manipulating her, even if he doesn't harm her and in fact benefits her. B could be liable for wrongdoing in such cases, and allowing liability in such cases would have the value of deterring intentional and negligent misrepresentation. Second, A can wrong the parents of a child, even if that child wouldn't have existed but for the wrongdoing, because the parents might have been made worse off, more higher medical expenses, for instance, as a result of having a child that they wouldn't have had but for the misrepresentation.
So civil liability to hold needs to recognize a harm in addition to a wrong. Just finding wrongdoing without any harm, a harmless error as it were, won't give rise to civil liability. So we need, in order for a court to award some kind of recovery, to identify, define the scope of the harm. And the problem with civil liability, at least the way that courts up till now have articulated it, is that that harm either isn't really a harm because the good that came from the very thing that's being claimed outweighed it, or in order to recognize that harm, the harm of having a kid at all or a kid of a particular type, is too offensive. It's against public policy, that the courts won't recognize this kind of harm because it violates some sacred norm, some idea about the way that parents love children, that the law won't recognize them, their birth, or this fact of their existence as that legal injury. So the problem has really to do with defining the harm in a way when that harm, again, is inextricably bundled with the fact that this particular child or type of child exists as opposed to a different one. Defining that harm in a way that isn't outweighed by the benefits of the child's existence to the parents, or by the offensive ideas that it sends, either to other people who have those very same characteristics, or to the child, him or herself, to be claimed as a harm, or the characteristics without which he or she couldn't have been born, as the basis for a harm to the parents who are supposed to love the child unconditionally. And so the problem is trying to say what that harm is in a way that isn't outweighed by the benefits or too offensive for the law to recognize.
Okay, thanks. And well, this will be the last question. And I've saved this for the last because I think it's the sort of question a lot of people always have in it. You alluded to some personal reasons already, but I think people always like to hear this kind of thing about speakers. Is there a specific experience that led you to pursue this area of law? What has driven your passion for this work?
So one question was, one reason that I became really interested in these ideas, it has to do with learning that, I was born the same week as Elizabeth Carr, the first American IVF baby. I found this out at the same time that I was reading some really interesting ideas by John Evans and others about reproductive ethics, questions about the non-identity problem, a gauntlet set forth by a philosopher, Derek Parfit, in 1984, and questions about parental ethics, what it means to be a parent or to parent well, to care for your children, that arose at an early age for me when I had an opportunity to take on a parental role earlier than usual. These questions just fascinated me. I thought they were just interesting and inescapable. They mattered for my life, for my own identity, the connection of who I was and where I came from, the kind of person I wanted to be, the family that I hoped to make, the one I had and that I wished for, and that I wanted to be such a big, important part of who I was and how I want to be remembered. I think that reproduction assumes that kind of significance for a lot of people. I mean, whether they are trying to have a child or not have a child, and whether they make the judgment that at a particular point in their life, having children is something that they're in a position to take on only in certain kinds of ways. And not for everybody, but for a lot of people, I think it assumes a much larger significance than, choices that we make every day, things about our jobs or where we live. These are enduring and meaningful. They go to the heart of who we are, what makes us us. That's certainly how I felt about me, about growing up as a kid and thinking on where I came from and the kind of person who I try to be and hope to become. So these questions have just been provocative in ways that I have found no resolution for. That's, I think, one of the other things that interests me about them so much. for everything I think about them, as many people as I talk to, the new cases that I learn about, new ideas that philosophers, sociologists, theologians, law professors come up with, nothing seems fully satisfactory or, conclusive. It seems only to raise more questions, hard questions. And being part of this conversation is something that I've just been so grateful for. That's been so rich, and I'm delighted and feel awfully fortunate to have shared with you all today.
Thank you very much, Dov. The talk and the questions were all just fascinating, thought-provoking, really, spot on for the mission of the Institute for Practical Ethics. Wish you luck with all your future endeavors here. And I'm sorry that we're on Zoom, and so normally you would hear lots of clapping now, but you'll just hear from me. Thank you for the questions, and if you enjoyed this, then please visit ipe.ucsd.edu, and you can sign up for on our mailing list to hear about more talks like this. Okay, and with that, let's have a good night, Dov.
A real pleasure and privilege. Thank you, Craig. Thanks all.